When I was checking out of my local Dollar Tree, the guy at the cash register said, "Is it any good?" And what he was referring to are these 2 boxes of tofu that I was getting. I told him I was about to find out. And I came to some mixed conclusions, which I will share at the end. I was drawn to the tofu because it is high in protein, it is shelf stable, and it seemed like it could be used in a variety of things. I know it gets a bad rap because I think a lot of people prepare it the wrong way, or at least in a poor way. Tofu can be time intensive in order for it to mimic the texture of meat. What you need to do is take the tofu out of the box onto a tea towel. You're going to be draining all of that water out. I found it easiest if you open both sides of the container. That way the vacuum seal is broken and it comes in, slides out a lot easier. Right now it's the consistency of a firm jello. You're then going to wrap your tea towel around your tofu and stick something heavy on top, like a cutting board and maybe a couple of cans, which is what I did. This is going to press a lot of the water out of the tofu. It's best if you start with a more firm tofu just because you'll have less water to try to get out of it. They only had firm tofu at my Dollar Tree, not extra firm or extra firm or any of that, but we worked with what we had. Now in this one box it says it has 4 servings, and I think there were 9 grams of protein per serving, so it packs a pretty good protein punch. I also went ahead and looked up on their website that this tofu is from, and it used recipes directly from their website, which I will link below. I figured if they made the tofu, maybe they would have some good ideas on how to create tasty meals with it. Now this tofu has been pressed for about an hour, and as you can see it's shrunk down and kind of got smushed a little bit, which is fine. Part of the reason why you are trying to remove as much liquid as possible is so that you can replace the tasteless liquid with things that are actually more flavorful, like chicken broth or vegetable broth or other kinds of soy sauce and that sort of thing. Now I stuck my tofu in a container and I stuck it in the freezer, and as you can see, after I took it out and thawed it, it actually has way more liquid because more liquid came out of the tofu as it froze. I went ahead and drained this off, and then I repeated the process, in part because I ran out of time on that day to film this video. So this happened twice. As you can see, it's considerably smaller, which I think makes it so that it looks really small when you're making your meals with it, but its texture was way better, I would say, than the tofu that I did not drain. You can see the striation, the little lines on the end. That's actually going to make it so it seems like it mimics chicken a little more. I went ahead and cut it up into fourths because I am making 3 recipes. I used 1/4 for 2 of the recipes, and then for one of the last recipes I used 2 of those cubes. I went ahead and cubed them up, and I kept them separate because I wanted to see if the texture difference really came through and if it was really necessary to do all those extra steps. Now I just added in soy sauce, sesame seed oil, vinegar, and a little bit of chopped up carrots. We're going to be making a simple rice stir fry. This actually turned out to be one of my favorite meals out of this batch. I added in some green onions from my garden and some chopped purple onions. They had scallions in the recipe and I just didn't have those on hand, so I figured that was a good replacement. I also used ground ginger in place of fresh ginger, which of course would have been way better, but I didn't have that on hand. I gave the marinade a good mix, and then I poured half on one of the recipes and half on the other. Then I went ahead and mixed it and let it marinate for about a half an hour in the liquid. While this is marinating, you would want to go ahead and cook up some rice. I already had some cooked up, but you want already cooked rice for this recipe. Now this recipe was so good at the end that I did end up thinking, man, I would go back and get tofu just so I could make this recipe because it was very delicious. One thing I found is that the tofu that was not drained has a texture that's similar to scrambled eggs, so it would work really well in burritos, maybe with like a sausage seasoning on it, or even mixed in with ground up sausage and added into burrito with some cheese on it, and that would make a really delicious breakfast burrito. The drained tofu actually has the flakiness of fish while having more of a neutral flavor like chicken. Now I'm making another marinade. This one's going to be for some fried tofu, and we're just using a dash of hot sauce, some vinegar, some soy sauce. An egg is what we're going to be using to dip in, as well as some flour, which I added some salt to. We also put in a little bit of Worcestershire sauce into our marinade. This recipe ended up being my least favorite out of the batch, so this is one I wouldn't highly recommend, but I wanted to show it because I show the failures as well as the successes here. I wouldn't say it really failed, it just was not a great recipe, or at least wasn't for somebody who isn't so used to tofu. If you're used to tofu and you like the texture and the flavor, then this might be an excellent recipe for you. I went ahead and marinated this as well for 30 minutes. The tofu that is not dehydrated did tend to not soak up the liquid as well, and as a result just wasn't as flavorful. I went ahead and separated each of the slices and made sure it was in the marinade, that way it had the best chance of soaking up everything. And now we're ready to kind of finish off that rice stir fry. I went ahead and poured some oil in the bottom of a pan and got it nice and hot, and we're going to start off with our dehydrated tofu. Now this one, it crisped up really well and really nicely, and it just had a nice caramelized look and taste to it. In retrospect, I probably should have added those carrots a little later just so they kept more of their color. They didn't need to cook quite as long as they ended up cooking, but it tasted good. It just lost some of its pretty color. I added on a little bit of soy sauce as well, and with some green onions on top, this is what we got in the end. The tofu was really flavorful, had a nice crunch to it, and it actually tasted a lot like a nice caramelized fish would, at least like a very mild fish. It didn't have a fishy flavor, just a fishy texture. Then I started on the second batch of tofu. This one I also added some soy sauce in. I tried to caramelize as best as possible, but tofu that isn't dehydrated doesn't caramelize quite as easily. You kind of have to cook it to death is another thing I found out, because I'm so used to making chicken, which you don't want to cook chicken to death, but tofu is kind of the opposite. You want to cook it even longer than you would think you would need to cook it, just to get a good texture to it as much as possible. As you can see, it got some really nice color on it. Now we're also going to fry up our battered tofu slices, I guess. They had a name for it, but these, they didn't turn out like their name made it sound. Their name made it sound so nice and delicious, and this kind of was a little disappointing to me. I went ahead and put it first in the flour to dry it completely off, then stuck it in the egg, and then back in the flour again just to get a really nice thick coat on the outside that would help it crisp up. I would say I noticed the biggest difference in this recipe, I would say, with the dehydrated tofu. The dehydrated tofu actually tasted the best compared with the non-dehydrated tofu. Another thing that I would say tofu might be really good in is desserts, just because it has that flan texture, that kind of jello texture. And I saw a couple recipes for dessert, so at some point I might try out some desserts and just see, if it is as good as I think it might be in a dessert. Now that it's fully coated, I went ahead and put it in the pan of oil and let it fry on both sides until it was golden brown. I also saw a recipe on the same website for like a chicken parmesan or tofu parmesan, where they put like mozzarella and tomato sauce and that sort of thing on top and just made it into a chicken parmesan type of thing. And I think that would taste really good, because I think what was really lacking here was flavor inside. It just didn't seem like it had absorbed enough flavor to make it a really good dish. The outside was nice and crispy, so that wasn't the issue. It was the inside was kind of floppy and it tasted like vinegar, but not much else. So it may have also been that the flavorings for the marinade were just not quite what they need to be. Now I went ahead and got started on our last recipe, which is going to be like a faux chorizo type of recipe. And we're just crumbling up our last two sections of tofu from each of these blocks, both the dehydrated and the non-dehydrated block. And this is what we get. It looks very similar to chicken to me, to shredded up chicken. I'm just making a marinade for this, and we're going to be using some garlic, some chopped garlic, some soy sauce, some vinegar, a little bit of oil, and a little bit of chili powder, some paprika, some oregano, some cumin, and coriander. This used a lot of spices. So just a little dash of ground cloves and a little dash of cinnamon as well. I would say this one was probably the most flavorful out of all of the recipes. Oh, and some salt. And I mean, that's due to the fact that we used like 10 spices in it, but they did taste really good. Now I poured half of the mixture on one of the bowls of tofu and half on the other, and just mixed it around and let it marinate for about 15 to 30 minutes. After having tried the dried tofu and the tofu fresh out of the packet, I would probably only recommend the dried tofu. I think the fresh tofu may be best if it is used in a dessert, just because it would be all blended up potentially like a pudding consistency. But the dried tofu is the only one that's going to have a really solid texture as far as being able to hold up against, you know, other things in a dish and not turn to mush. This, I went ahead and chopped up some green onions on top and put it on top of a heated up tortilla, and it tasted really good. It was very crumbly, so I think it needed some cheese or something to help it hold together so it didn't just fall all to pieces outside, or even like a cream sauce or a cheese sauce on it would have been really good and added a lot of good flavor. So, final thoughts. Is the tofu any good? Yes. But would I recommend it just straight out of the box? No. I think dehydrating it really greatly improves that flavor, so I would highly recommend that. I also would say you would want to add other ingredients like rice or cheese or things. It really needs other things to help spice it up, because just on its own, it's really bland. But if you are on a tight budget, I think this is an excellent way to go. Thanks for joining me as I experiment today, and I hope to see you in the next one.